Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with a new series. So we are going to be covering the Alberta United Conservative Party leadership race and edging into the future as I get some more stuff working, because most of the stuff I need to do to get this working is what I would need to do to get the Alberta provincial election series working. It is nice and handy. It is double duty for the same work. So once I have some more work done, you can expect a 2023 Alberta election forecast to start. I'm not sure the frequency of them because it's polling, but some will occur. I had to rush to get this done, so I do apologize. The map is maybe not the highest quality yet. I am polishing it up still, but I've really run out of time to film this, and it's good enough for now. If I didn't point it out, I feel like people probably wouldn't have even noticed. Might not even know what I don't like about the map right now, but I'm working on it. The colors I have chosen here are not particularly relevant. Again, I have picked the colors for the candidates in a leadership race for distinctiveness, not because I think they inherently mean anything. Now, that said, you will note there's only a few people on the scoreboard up here, and there's technically many people in the race. I think we're at 7? I would have to double check going forward, but I think it's 7. The reason why I only have Taze, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I've heard him say it, and it sounded like that, so I'm going with Taze. Smith and Jean is, well, they're the only ones who are cracking double digits, and I think are the only ones who are relevant to win. Now, mind you, this is a what's the word for it? This is a runoff election, because for some reason every party likes to do ranked ballots, even though, as I've discussed in other series, I think ranked choice ballots are actually not particularly good ballots. It's not a good way to run a leadership system, but we will accept it. That said, it is more tolerable for a leadership race than it is for a general election, but it's still not the best way to run it. But with that said, I have one other caveat I want to smack out here before I go deeper into this. So, the polling is relatively sparse so far for this race, and it's not stellar. I don't think there's anything wrong per se in what the pollsters are doing. At least I can't point out to any mistakes I'm seeing or anything suspect in it. It just doesn't have the data density I want. So some criteria are not really there. Like, I don't have urbanicity data, which I think partially is making this map look... Oops, sorry about that. It's causing us to look smoother than it is. I don't quite have as much data. What's the word for it? I would like to have more data for how other parties view these candidates. So, like, which one do the NDPers like? Which one do the Alberta Party like? Which one does the UCP like, for example, et cetera, et cetera. I really just have the UCP headline numbers, which, yes, technically speaking, that's the only ones that matter, but for esoteric reasons, it does actually make it easier to project the riding level results better. And as always, leadership races are much harder to project because you have no historical data to go by. At least you sort of have by proxy historical data, but not as much as I'd like. So this is relatively smooth. Like, for example, Edmonton is, by my model, is forecast narrowly to Jean, and Calgary's edged to Smith. I think that is mostly correct, but I think in reality, if the United Conservative Party were to publish the data by riding, and you could actually graph it out, you're likely going to see it's not the smooth. There's going to probably be some areas where Jean, I'm getting confused with Jean Charest, and I'm 100% certain Brian Jean is not pronounced Jean, but if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. But the point is, I'm 100% certain that Edmonton is not going to be smoothly, narrowly to Brian Jean. That said, I'm fully confident that he's doing better in the city than the other two main candidates, but I don't have the data to really get that level of projection. So, all of this to say, take this whole map. It's useful for illustrative purposes, but it's not... I don't have a lot of confidence in the map. Vote percentage? 100%. Very confident in these. Map? Not very confident. Not very confident in the map at all. So, take map with some salt. I mostly have the map here as an illustrative guideline because, again, I think the fact that Smith is doing better in Calgary and Jean is doing better in Edmonton seems plausible based on the polling data. The fact Jean's doing better in northern Alberta and this western bit versus the rest of it, generally speaking, is going better for Smith. Again, I think that is mostly correct, but it shouldn't be this smooth, if that makes sense. I can't correct that, though, because of the aforementioned polling limitations and the fact that this is a leadership race and I have no historical data to really to project forward. Projecting forward historical trends is always easier than doing this because the most important way to... the strongest predictor of your future vote is your past vote. Obviously, people do flip parties and flip vote choices, but generally speaking, who you're voting for last time, it's likely going to be who you're going to vote for next. So, with that said, let's start discussing this race. So, there's the reason I only have Taze, Smith, and Jean here, as I've mentioned earlier, is these are really the only ones with double-digit support, and I think they're the only ones who really matter. Everyone else is in the low, under 5. And the way I see this race unfolding, so the way it looks is Taze is the UCP version of Jason Kenney, but different, if that makes sense. So he's not radically different from Jason Kenney. He's fiscal conservative, has a bunch of ideas that are actually quite strongly fiscally conservative. He's, relatively speaking, more establishment than the other two, but in a lot of terms, when you say establishment of the party, that seems to be referring, or that normally is a diminutive. In this particular case, I don't know how applicable that is. I'm not Albertan. I can't really comment on how actually conservative Taze is in governing. His platform and his rhetoric seem relatively conservative. Shouldn't be that surprising. He's conservative in the most conservative province in Canada, but he seems mainstream, maybe. Maybe that's the way to put it. He's one video I have watched. He seems like he has a strong opinion, but it's kind of hard to say. Because the core gist... I'll get to that in a second, actually. Smith, on the other hand, is very, very clearly the populist conservative candidate. I don't want to... It's not an entirely accurate comparison to compare it to Poilievre, because Poilievre is a mainstream conservative leaning populist, whereas Smith seems to be a populist conservative leaning mainstream. That sounds similar, but there is a distinct difference here. The most important of these differences is some of the platform positions Smith has. The Alberta Sovereignty Act, for example, is wildly populist. It is questionably, if it's even you could even consider it conservative. I feel like it's kind of politically neutral, but it's wildly populist. Overall, she seems to be also flirting with soft Alberta nationalism. She hasn't gone all in on it, but she's definitely flirting with it. And when I say soft nationalism, I don't mean the Parti Québécois, we're going to leave Canada separatism. I mean the Francois Legault, we're going to only care about our province, and we're going to extract everything we can from the feds. That's kind of what I see from her, based on what I've seen so far. And then we have Jean. He seems to be a much more libertarian, based on his platform commitments he said so far. I know he was, and Smith as well, were leaders of the former Wild Rose Party, which tended to be more socially conservative than the Progressive Conservative Party. But I don't know if I would describe either of them as social conservatives. Notably, in Jean's platform, he does say people should have the quote-unquote autonomy rights to choose medically assisted dying, unless I'm misreading his platform. And if I am, correct me in the comments. That's not socially conservative at all. That's a wildly unsocially conservative thing to say. It's very libertarian in the classical libertarian sense. The classical, what I mean, is like the libertarian in whatever I say about me goes. Doesn't matter anything you think, as long as I want to do it and it affects me. Because there's a lot of other arguments against medically assisted dying, but I won't go into that in this video. But it's a very libertarian position to support it. Left-wing, possibly, as well, but it's not conservative. Now, that's not to say you can't be a libertarian and vote conservative. It's just, when we're talking about where ideologically something sits, well, that's where you see it. So, that's kind of the overall arching of where these candidates are. And I will note, Jean is also sort of soft flirting with the soft nationalism. Soft flirting? That's kind of weird. Taze has very strongly pushed away from it. He decided against going to there's a conference or a town hall, I can't think of the proper term for it, an event recently that was hosted by Alberta Independence Party, and he refused to go to that, or was an affiliate to the Alberta Independence Party, regardless. But Jean and Smith both went. Again, that is not strictly speaking to say that they are supporting independence for Alberta, but they are flirting with that faction. Whereas Taze is very strongly against that faction. Which again, kind of supports the general narrative that Taze is more of a establishment-y conservative. In fact, in some ways, he might be slightly more establishment-y than Kenney. But, given how Kenney acted during COVID, and sure, you can argue that he had less lockdowns and less measures than other people, but he still arrested pastors. He still shut down churches. He still introduced lockdowns. Yes, other conservative premiers did that, but you know what? That makes you a very bad conservative, deploying those things. Vaccine passports, too. One of the most abhorrent, unconservative things you could possibly do. Abhorrent in general, but it's also extremely unconservative. Considering, again, this is the thing people always have to note. Conservatism and left, right in general, are relative to a society. You can point to, like many people do, and be like, oh, this is a very common one you see online saying, like, the Democratic Party in the US is right-wing European party. First off, that by itself is actually just factually wrong, but the reason people can even attempt to make that comparison is what's left and right in Europe is different than what's left and right in North America. They're different. Europe tends to be more statist across the board. Conservatives are more paternal autocrat is kind of a loaded term, but they're more paternalistic in Europe. And North America, conservatism tends to lean towards liberty. We can even look at this conservative Mexican parties. There's one of the leaders has even suggested unbanning guns in Mexico. That is not something you would see a European leader say. And this isn't a fringe Mexican party. I believe she was the leader of the third largest party. But we're not talking about Mexico here. So the climate is different. So in North America, liberty and personal responsibility and autonomy are the bedrocks of conservatism in North America. Every single possible COVID measure is paternalistic and violates personal responsibility and autonomy. So every single thing you could possibly do in COVID violates the core tenets of conservatism. So in that regard, a lot of conservative premiers in Canada are conservative in name only. And in a lot of ways, that is what's coloring this race. That's why it's happening. Kenney, of the premiers in Canada that are conservative, possibly the exception of Scott Moe, is one of the more conservative ones. And some people even argue he's a very smart and very cerebral person, in the words of J.J. McCullough. But that doesn't matter, because he broke the fundamental compact that voters want, that they expect from a conservative leader. You can talk about your fiscal conservatism or your social conservatism or anything else, but if you break the fundamental understanding that personal responsibility, autonomy, and freedom, you're breaking the core understanding of North American conservatism. And I will also strongly note, too, even North America liberalism is wildly more pro-freedom than European ones. Even the most left-wing states in the US locked down less hard than countries like Germany. Germany had curfews. You couldn't go outside your house for non-essential purposes. Very, very few US states even approached that. No Canadian province except Quebec approaches that. And Quebec, as possibly the sole exception, tends to be more European in its political axis than the rest of Canada. That's why the Conservative Party federally does poorly in Quebec. It's not because there's no conservative Quebecers. It's because Quebec conservatism is different to the rest of Canada. Though that might be changing with Eric Dunham's Conservative Party of Quebec, but that is a different series. So what did this mean for this race? So the backdrop of Kenney being kicked out as leader by barely winning a no confidence vote in his leadership by the UCP is a backlash to this betrayal of the core understanding of North America conservatism. The core heart of the movement, the ideology, the political parties. He violated that core tenet. Smith and Jean are the answer to that. And by that I mean that's not quite the right words I want to say. They are the response to that. Jean, in his platforms and from what I can tell historically, fully, strongly goes into personal responsibility, autonomy, and freedom. That's why libertarianism, by the way, is quite popular in North America and almost non-existent in Europe. Because libertarianism, at its core, is those things, though you add other things on top of it. But that's the core of it. The difference between conservatism and libertarianism is the social aspect. Libertarianism, generally speaking, doesn't think anything can go wrong by letting people do things such as drugs. Conservatism sees allowing a social vice like drugs as a negative to society and shouldn't be allowed. That, for example, is one of the core differences. But that's also why libertarianism and conservatism can coexist so easily, because there's very few, and most of the differences are very specific. Which is why, again, in Canada or the US, libertarians tend to vote conservative or Republican. Smith is the populist side of this. This is the group of conservatives growing, by the way. This is the Trump group. I'll rephrase that. This is the group Trump played off of in the US, is the disaffected group of the voter base, possibly the conservative side, but not necessarily conservatives, or at least historic conservatives, disaffected voters who think the system isn't working for them. In the case of Smith, it's the system of confederation isn't working for Alberta. In the case of the US, it was the party establishments, the uniparty kind of stuff. So Smith is going at this in a way that, yes, you are right, average Albertan who is upset and unhappy about how Ottawa seems to be running all over our jurisdiction, screwing with our economy, hurting our businesses, destroying our companies. Yeah, you're right to be upset. That is dumb. That's literally her, and that's her sales pitch. And don't dismiss it. It's a persuasive sales pitch. And in fact, that's why she's leading the pack. And I would even go so far as to say, again, I don't have second round, I don't have third round, I don't have fourth round, though there was a Main Street poll that did simulate the full ballot, and Smith won. I think Smith is going to win because of that. She has the narrow lead right now, and I think fundamentally Jean supporters will support Smith first, and I think if it came down to Smith versus Jean, the Tay supporters would be split, because I don't think they necessarily like either of them more or less. My suspicion, though, is that Jean is, because of the polls as they're going, he's doing slightly worse over time, and Taze is doing slightly better. And right now, the way it is, it's likely would be a Jean versus Smith runoff once you process through everyone else. Todd Lewin likely would... His voters would likely put Jean or Smith as their second or third. But everyone else seems to be more establishment-y, party-based people who are likely going to have Taze as their next guy before Smith and Jean. So if Jean gets tracks down to maybe 28-29%, I expect the runoff to eventually be Taze versus Smith. And in that regard, I think Smith is probably going to get close to 60-70% of the vote. Somewhere in that range. Let's say 65. Though it's not... It depends on the polling going forward. I'm not sure how much more we're going to get. We have till October, so we have maybe... We'll see if September gives us. So, there is that. That's big. I don't think Taze could actually beat either of them in a head-to-head. Because, again, I think the populist conservatives of Smith are more likely to just not vote than vote for Taze. Jean, covering two different pronunciations of Jean/Jean is really annoying. Jean supporters are... they seem, based off the platforms, based on the rhetoric, seem to be more likely to support Smith. Again, I can't confirm this. I don't have the data for this per se, though Main Street also does support my supposition. So, what does this generally mean, right? Well, Albertans are unhappy. Big shock. They don't really like their hand they're being dealt in Confederation. They don't like the idea of just generic conservatism. They don't think it's working. Taze, if he wins, would be the reaffirming that generic Canadian conservatism is fine for Albertans. I say generic because, again, I don't actually dislike Taze's platform, but the way he's articulating his platform and what he has on his platform, it's mainstream. It's not populist. It's not a radical departure of the status quo. It's not even really challenging the status quo very heavily. It's very tame. They seem like good ideas, and from what I understand, he was a relatively competent finance minister, so he likely would execute the ideas well. But he doesn't seem to be the person for the time for the Albertan voter. And that's the interesting thing in politics, especially leadership races. There's always a time and a place for a campaign style. If this happened 2 years ago, I think Taze would win easily. But after COVID, after the inflation, after the likely economic hardship we're going to see, again, we don't know the next Q2 numbers yet, but I believe it looks like the Q2 numbers are going to be worse than Q1 and possibly negative, though again, we don't really know yet. In this moment, people don't want mainstream. They don't want generic because it didn't work for them. If things were good, Smith would not be even somebody considered. And you look back at 2012, she lost handily as the leader of the Wild Rose Party. Because that message and that position wasn't what was wanted in 2012 when things were fine. The feds weren't combating Alberta. There wasn't any big crises that occurred. There wasn't major overreach. And similarly, if this was an NDP incumbent government, someone like Taze might actually have a better chance. But the fact that it is replacing Kenny means it's almost certainly going to be Smith or Jean replacing him, because Taze is too similar. Taze might have a chance next leadership race, if he even still is relevant enough to run in another one, because, again, I don't know how old he is, but He looks to be in his mid-50s from the pictures I've seen of him. And, now the leadership race, assuming Smith and or Jean doesn't get smashed in 2023, that'd be, 10 years? It's very unlikely that he would still be relevant 10 years from now, unless he manages to maintain position as finance minister. But we'll see. It's never impossible. I mean, who would have thought that the U.S. would have 2 geriatrics after each other? It does happen. But it seems to me, more than anything, that Smith is tapping into the zeitgeist of the moment. And I strongly suspect she might even be able to pull off a first ballot win. Again, the most recent Main Street poll had her at 42%, which was like a 20% increase from the last Main Street poll. Not wildly out of the picture. We'll see how the campaign keeps going. It is early days yet. And she doesn't have all the big names or big endorsements or anything going her way. In fact, she even has people like Kenny denouncing her, which I don't think hurts her. People have to remember that the UCP members did not want. We're not super thrilled on keeping Kenny. Only 51% of voters in the nomination voted for him. That's not super thrilled. That doesn't give you a lot of sway over the base to convince them to vote otherwise or elsewhere. And he's attacking her over the Sovereignty Act, which I think is, I don't know, polling for this, but I suspect Albertan conservatives are actually want it. It might be crazy. It might be a stupid idea. You can call it whatever you like, but I think they want it. I could be wrong. If you're Albertan, please comment below. I'd like to see your opinion on it. Frankly, if you're Albertan, comment anything you want to see about the race, because they're super useful to get more local perspectives. I'm looking at this as a outsider. I'm not from Alberta. Nor do I guess I do know people from Alberta, but no one currently living there. So, what does this mean? Well, I really will see partially how Poilievre does on September 10th, and I think that'll be a canary in a coal mine, if that makes sense. If he does as well as my model is for forecasting, or possibly even better, Poilievre that is, I think Smith has a non-zero chance at hitting the first ballot win with the right campaign. Remember, campaigns mean everything. You can come up with the best platform and the best idea, but if your messaging is off, well, you're SOL. So if Smith hits the right messaging in the way she's campaigning herself, I think there is a potential that she could pull a first ballot win. I don't think it's very high right now, but the polling's going in the right direction. She seems to be taking Poilievre's campaign as inspiration, and Poilievre is likely going to get greater than 70% support in Alberta. So it is very possible. And in fact, even right now on a second, or what would this be, like a sixth ballot race, I think Smith would probably get around 60%, 65% of the vote. So it is a possibility. Can she do that earlier? I don't know, it depends. The big issue for her winning first ballot would be Brian Jean. Because in a general lane kind of idea, Taze is kind of your... the normal Canadian labels don't really apply here because Alberta is so much more conservative than the rest of Canada. So Taze is, in Alberta, a moderate conservative, though nationally he'd probably be more of a true blue. his rhetoric and his positions on most fiscal issues are much closer to Poilievre's than, say, Jean Charest. So, I don't know. It's hard to place it, the lane thing, because it's just so different in Alberta because the difference in how conservative it is. But the Jean and Smith are both flirting with a soft nationalism. They're both flirting with ways to reduce or take back power from Ottawa, either Smith's Sovereignty Act or Jean, he's proposed just not using provincial resources to enforce federal laws, which, in other words, is normally called a sanctuary state and or province, which will be interesting. So there's similarities between them, and there is potential there. It just depends. And Smith does have the early lead between the two, so if she can just keep that momentum, it's possible. If she flounders, we might see an inverse and Jean get there. But I think it's likely that by October 21st, Taze finishes second, but I don't see a path to victory for him. But I'll end that. And I will note, in case anyone's wondering, he's not actually on this map yet, but he is trending up in the polls, and I'm only forecasting the first round here. So, but anyways, if you like the video, press that like button. Subscribe, everybody. It really helps the channel. It's weirdly effective on the algorithm. For some reason, the more you subscribe, the more views I get. Weird how that works, right? If you have any comments on this, like if you think I should improve something on the map, or you think I got something wrong, or you think this was really cool, or you have some local perspective, I'd like to hear all of that. It's really helpful. I can't stress this enough. Anecdotal data is helpful for contextualizing polling. It doesn't replace polling, but it helps you understand it. So, I love any chance I can to get more of that. It's really helpful. If you think something is wildly off in what the writing projections are, more so than what I described in the beginning of the video, please let me know, because I can try to fix that. This is the first draft edit, and it took a lot more effort than I'd have liked to get the Alberta data, but I eventually did get it. But with that, I'll bid you all adieu, and I will see you likely next week with something slightly different.